He wrote me out of his will the same year I paid off his second mortgage, $43,000. His signature was notarized on a Tuesday. I found out on a Thursday when his attorney called me, not to tell me he was dying, but to tell me what had already been decided, and what I did next, they never saw coming. Before I continue, subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. My name doesn't matter the way my function mattered to that family. I was 34 years old, a contracts compliance manager for a mid-sized logistics firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. I had been in that role for 6 years by the time this story ends. I wore plain clothes to work. I drove a reliable car that I had purchased used with cash. I did not talk about money because people who grow up the way I grew up learn early that talking about money is either a performance or a weapon, and I had no interest in either. My apartment was quiet and clean. I liked it that way. I had built a life that did not make noise because I had spent the first 30 years of my life surrounded by people who made nothing but. My father, Gerald, I will call him by his name because I have earned the right to use it, was a man who mistook resentment for authority. He was not a violent man. That would have been simpler. He was the other kind. The kind who made you feel like your existence was an ongoing inconvenience he had chosen to tolerate out of some barely concealed generosity. He had 2 daughters. My older sister Renee had given him 3 grandchildren and a son-in-law who called him Sir. I had given him nothing he could display. I had a career he couldn't explain to his friends, a quiet apartment he had never visited, and a habit of saying no to things I could not afford, which made him, somehow, the most insulted person in the room. The financial history between us is not complicated. It only feels complicated when you are inside it. From the outside, it is a straight line. It began when I was 26. Gerald had refinanced the house he shared with his wife, my stepmother Linda, who I will come back to, and taken out a home equity line of credit to fund a small landscaping business that lasted 14 months before folding. When the HELOC payments became unmanageable, he called me, not Renee, me. I transferred $8,000 to his checking account on a Friday afternoon in November 2018. He did not say thank you. He said, "Good, that covers this month." It continued when I was 28. His truck needed transmission work, $3,100. He said he would pay me back when the tax return came. The tax return came. I did not hear from him. It continued when I was 30. The second mortgage, this one he actually asked for, formally, in the sense that he emailed me a number. $43,000 against the house. Because Linda had medical expenses from a knee replacement and Gerald had decided that refinancing was a smarter move than touching the retirement account. I will tell you something about that retirement account. I will tell you about it later. I transferred the money in 2 installments. I have the wire confirmations in a folder that I keep in a drawer next to my lease agreement. The total, by my last count before everything shifted, was $61,400, not including the smaller amounts, the grocery runs when I was in town, the birthday money I sent to his grandchildren, the one time I paid his electric bill over the phone while he was on the other line complaining about gas prices, $61,400, and he wrote me out of his will. He had always been clear that he did not think much of me as a daughter. Not in screaming or throwing things, not that way. In the quieter, more erosive way, the offhand comment at Easter dinner about how Renee had always been the nurturing one, the way he never asked about my work, the way he introduced me to people at family functions with a kind of vague apology in his posture, like he wasn't sure how to account for me. I had lived with that for so long that it had stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like weather, just a condition of the environment, unchangeable, something you dressed for. What I could not have predicted was the phone call. It came on a Wednesday in March 2025. Gerald had been in the hospital for 3 weeks by then. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in January. I had known he was sick. I had not been called to the hospital. I had learned about the diagnosis from my Aunt Patrice, his younger sister, who texted me a picture of a get-well card she had sent and assumed I had sent one too. I had not sent one. I had not been told directly. The man who called me was named David Mercer. He identified himself as Gerald's estate attorney. His voice was careful and measured and slightly apologetic, the way attorneys get when they are delivering information they know is going to land badly. He told me that Gerald had updated his estate documents in November 2024, 4 months before the call, 2 months before the diagnosis was confirmed, and that in those documents, I had been explicitly excluded from inheritance, the house, the retirement account, a life insurance policy I had not known existed, and a savings account, all of it directed to Renee and to Linda. He paused after he said it. I think he expected me to cry or argue. I didn't. I said, "Why are you calling me then?" He paused again. He said he was calling because Gerald had left me a note, a handwritten letter, sealed, to be delivered to me upon his death or upon his authorization prior to it. Gerald had authorized delivery. The letter was coming by certified mail. Mr. Mercer said I should expect it within 3 business days. He said, and I will not forget this, he said, "I'm sorry this is the way this had to happen." There was a weight in it that felt like more than professional courtesy. I filed that away. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking garage outside my building for what might have been 45 minutes. The concrete above me had water stains on it that looked like something geographic, like a map of a place that doesn't exist. I stared at them until my eyes adjusted, and then I drove home and I opened my laptop and I started from the beginning. I had my own records. I had kept them not out of suspicion but out of habit. I work in contracts compliance. I document everything. It is not a choice. It is a reflex. I pulled every wire transfer, every bank statement, every text message and email that referenced money between me and Gerald. I built a spreadsheet. Column 1, date. Column 2, amount. Column 3, documentation type. Column 4, Gerald's stated reason. Column 5, whether he ever referenced repayment. $61,400, documented in 37 separate entries, spanning 8 years, and then I found something I had not been looking for. In going through the wire confirmation records, I noticed that 2 of the transfers, the second and third installments of the $43,000 second mortgage payment, had not gone to Gerald's personal checking account. They had gone to a different account number, a routing number I didn't recognize. I had not noticed at the time because I was sending money he had requested and I was doing it quickly, the way you do when you want it to be over, and the account he had given me the first time had been his own. The second time I had transferred using a number he had given me over text. I had the text. I had the confirmation. The account I had sent $26,000 to was not Gerald's personal account. I did not know whose account it was. Not yet. Drop the word rise in the comments. I read every single one. My Aunt Patrice called me on a Thursday. Not about Gerald or not only about Gerald. She called because she had heard through some telephone line of family information I have never fully understood that Mercer had contacted me. She asked how I was doing in a way that meant she already knew something. I said I was doing all right. She said she needed to come by. She arrived at my apartment on a Saturday morning with a canvas tote bag and a thermos of coffee she had made herself, the way she always did. Patrice is 62 years old. She taught middle school mathematics for 27 years before she retired. She does not tolerate imprecision of any kind. She sat at my kitchen table and she pulled a manila folder from the tote bag. She set it on the table between us and she put her hands flat on top of it. And she looked at me and she said, "I want you to know I tried to talk to him about this." She paused. He didn't listen. He never did. She slid the folder across. Inside was a paper trail that Patrice had been accumulating for 3 years. Not because she had been planning something, she told me. Because something had bothered her at a family gathering in 2022 and she had started paying attention, the way she had trained herself to pay attention to the students who were failing quietly. She had noticed Linda. She had noticed the way Linda handled conversations about money when Gerald was not in the room, and the way those conversations changed when he was. She had noticed new furniture in the house on 2 separate visits. She had noticed Gerald's affect, distracted, slightly confused about dates, occasionally contradicting himself on financial details he would previously have had sharp recall of. The folder contained printouts, copies of documents Patrice had obtained through channels I did not ask her to name, because she was clearly not going to name them and because I trusted her. What they showed, or what they suggested, with enough clarity to require explanation, was that the savings account Gerald had, an account in both his and Linda's name, the one listed in his estate documents, had received a series of transfers over the course of 4 years. Transfers from Gerald's personal checking account, transfers that reduced his individual holdings steadily over time, in a pattern that looked deliberate. I looked at the routing number on one of the transfer records. I looked at the routing number in my own spreadsheet. The account I had sent $26,000 to 3 years ago was the joint savings account. Gerald had given me Linda's account number and told me it was his. Patrice watched me make that connection. She said, "You want it quiet or you want it true?" I said, "I want it documented." Gerald died on April 3rd, 2025. It was a Thursday. I was at my desk at work when my phone lit up with Renee's name, and I knew before I answered what it was going to be. I said I was sorry. I was sorry, not for my own loss, which felt like the closing of something that had been half shut for years, but for the general fact of death, which is always sorrowful regardless of the person. Renee said the funeral would be the following Saturday. She said, "I'll send you the details." She did not say, "I need you here." She did not say, "I hope you're okay." She said, "I'll send you the details," in the same tone you'd use to confirm a meeting time. I went. I wore a black coat and flat shoes, and I sat in the second row because the first was reserved for Linda and Renee and the grandchildren. I did not cry. I looked at the casket, and I felt something that is hard to name, a kind of finality that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the way an old scar is adjacent to a wound. At the reception, held at the house, Linda thanked me for coming with precisely the warmth you would offer a colleague at an office event. Renee showed me pictures of Gerald from a vacation the family had taken the previous summer, a trip I had not been invited on, a trip that had been partially funded, I later discovered, by the money I had sent. There was a moment near the end of the reception when Linda stepped away from a conversation to refill her drink, and our eyes met across the kitchen. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like calculation, the recognition that I knew something, and the question of how much. I looked at her until she looked away. The estate attorney sent the formal documentation within 2 weeks of Gerald's death. The letter Gerald had written to me was also delivered by hand. David Mercer brought it himself, which I noted and which told me something about what the letter contained. It was 2 pages. Gerald's handwriting, slightly shaky, the way it gets when a person is in pain and trying to appear otherwise. He wrote about the years of distance between us. He wrote about decisions he said he had made for reasons I wouldn't understand. He wrote near the end that he had never meant for things to go the way they had with Linda. He wrote that there were things about the account he had told me to use that he had not fully understood at the time. He did not explain that further. He did not apologize. He came close. He wrote, "I know you've carried things that weren't yours to carry." That was as close as he got. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer with my wire confirmation records. 2 days after receiving the letter, I retained my own attorney. A woman named Cynthia Braun, who works in estate litigation and who had been recommended to me by a colleague who had been through something adjacent. I met with Cynthia on a Tuesday morning, and I brought my folder, Patrice's folder, the wire records, the bank statements, the text messages with account numbers, and Gerald's letter. I laid them on her conference table in chronological order. She went through them without speaking. When she was done, she looked up and said, "This is more than I usually see on a first meeting." I said, "I've been in contracts compliance for 6 years. I document everything." She said, "That's going to matter." The legal process that followed is not a story I will tell in full detail here, because it is ongoing in some of its dimensions, and because some of what Cynthia advised me to do, I was advised to do quietly. What I will tell you is this: the account that received $26,000 of my money without my informed consent was examined. The pattern of transfers from Gerald's individual accounts to joint holdings over a 4-year period was examined. David Mercer, The estate attorney provided testimony that was notably cooperative, given that his cooperation had not been requested by Linda or Renee. It turns out that when an attorney calls you 2 weeks before someone dies and delivers information that could be read as a warning, they may be doing exactly that. The confrontation, if you can call it that, and I think you can, even if it was quieter than the word implies, happened in May at a meeting that was framed as a family discussion about the estate. Renee had called it. She wanted to talk about the house, about Gerald's car, about items of sentimental value. Linda was present, Patrice was present, because she is family, and I had asked her to come. A neighbor of Gerald's, a woman named Beverly, who had been close to Gerald for 20 years and who had known Linda for almost as long, came to drop off a dish and stayed when Linda asked her to stay. I noted the presence of witnesses and said nothing about it. Renee spoke first. She said there were some accounts and assets to discuss. She said it in a tone that assumed the discussion would be short and confirmatory, that the will said what it said, that the documents were clear, and that my presence in the room was essentially ceremonial. I waited until she finished. I let the room settle. Then I opened the folder I had brought and I placed 3 items on the coffee table, face up. The wire confirmation showing the transfer of $26,000. The text message from Gerald with the account number, a copy of the joint account statement showing the same routing number. I said, I'd like to understand how $26,000 I sent to my father ended up in a joint account without my knowledge. I said it at a normal volume, in a normal tone. I was not performing calm. I was calm. There is a difference. Linda said the account information must have been a mistake. Her voice was even, but her hands were not quite still. I said, I have Gerald's letter. I said, I have a meeting scheduled with my attorney on Friday. I said, I'm not here to make this ugly. I'm here to make sure the record is complete. Beverly, sitting near the window with her dish towel on her lap, was very still. Renee was looking at the wire confirmation with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger, not guilt, but something that looked like the specific discomfort of realizing you have been performing confidence in a story that may not be true. Linda looked at me for a moment, and then she looked away. Not dramatically, not with tears. Her face simply shifted into something that was no longer performing. Because there was no longer an audience to perform for that had not already seen the documents on the table. That was the moment. That was all I needed it to be. The months that followed were not simple, but they were clean in the way that things get clean when you have documentation and patience and a good attorney. The estate proceedings became complicated in ways that ultimately did not favor the version of events Linda had been presenting. I will not speculate in public about intent or conclusion, that is for the court process to determine, but I will tell you that the $26,000 plus interest was the beginning of a conversation that opened much larger questions about the management of Gerald's finances over the last 4 years. Renee called me in June. She did not lead with an apology. She led with a question. She said, "Did you know about all of this before the meeting?" I said yes. She was quiet. Then she said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I said I was still figuring out how much of it I already knew without knowing I knew it. That answer took me a moment to locate, but when I found it, it was the truest thing I could have said. There are things you understand intellectually and things you understand in your body, and the body is always slower but always more certain, and I had been carrying a body-level knowledge of something wrong for years before I had the documents to match it. Renee and I have not repaired anything. We have achieved something that is like civility, but quieter and more cautious, like 2 people sharing space in a room where something broke and has not been removed. I think that is probably the right pace. I started therapy in May 2025, a woman in Columbus who specializes in family systems and financial trauma, and who in our first session said something I want to pass on because I think about it often. She said, "You are not wrong to give. You were wrong to give to people who had decided what you were worth before you walked in the door. There is a difference between generosity and tribute. Tribute is what you pay when you believe you have to earn your place. That landed somewhere specific inside me. It is still landing. Gerald's house is still in the estate proceedings. The retirement account, the one he said he didn't want to touch, had in fact been touched. Quite significantly, Patrice's folder had that too. The life insurance policy is under review. David Mercer's phone call, I have come to understand, was not entirely procedural. Sometimes the people in the room know things they cannot say directly, and they find the nearest door and open it a crack. I walked through. I am still at the same firm. I got a promotion in August, senior contracts manager, with a team of 4 and a salary that makes the $61,400 feel like a number I can look at from a distance now, rather than one I have to live inside. I drove past Gerald's house once in September, not on purpose. I was meeting Patrice for lunch, and the route took me near it. The lawn was not as well kept as it used to be. I noticed that, and I kept driving. The door to whatever this family was is not wide open. I do not imagine it will be. But I have not locked it either. That is not generosity toward the people who made certain decisions. It is just honesty about the fact that grief and family are long and complicated, and I am 34 years old, and I do not yet know everything I will feel about this in 10 years. I know what I know now, and what I know now is that I have my records, I have my attorney, I have Patrice, and I have my own name on my own accounts. That is enough. For now, that is exactly enough. If this touched something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.